After the release of Yakuza Dead Souls, we would see the start of one of RGG's most interesting development cycles to date. The team wanted the next mainline Yakuza title to serve as a sort of soft reboot for the series, as they felt that Dead Souls was the endpoint of everything they had developed for the series up to that point. This soft reboot approach would see them doing things like making a whole new engine for the game to run on, writing the largest scale story in the series' history, and just generally making a game that greatly eclipsed the ambition of everything that came before it. This game would even have the longest development cycle in the series up to this point, with the team giving it a whole 2 years in the oven rather than their typical 1 year. And on December 5th of 2012, Yakuza 5 would finally be released. The game would quickly become notorious among the community for its insane scope and sheer amount of content packed into it, with it still being regarded as the most difficult game in the series to 100% to this day, simply due to how long it takes to complete every piece of content on offer. And over the last couple weeks, I've sat down to play through Yakuza 5 for the first time ever in a whopping 60-hour first playthrough, and I've come out of that experience with a ton of opinions on this one. So was Yakuza 5 the biggest and best Yakuza game yet, or did it end up like many other RPGs that aim for this sort of scale and become an overly bloated mess? Well, let's talk about it. But before getting too far into the video, I should mention that this is the 9th in a series of videos where I'm playing every game in the Yakuza series for the first time in release order and reviewing them as I go along. You don't have to have seen the rest of the videos in order to enjoy this one, but I would definitely recommend watching my videos on the earlier titles if you want some better context on my feelings towards them and the series as a whole, or you just like your stories complete. So for those of you that are interested, I'll have the playlist containing the full series in the description below. But with that out of the way, Yakuza 5 is an action-adventure game developed by Ryuga Gotoku Studio and published by Sega for the PlayStation 3 in 2012. Yakuza 5 follows a similar format to games like Yakuza 4 and Dead Souls, with players controlling a variety of different characters throughout the story, with each of them eventually coming together near the end for the finale. But where each character in those games felt like one part of the overall product, due to Yakuza 5's sheer scale, the characters here each feel like they've been given their own full-blown Yakuza title. To start, the game opens with us playing as Kazuma Kiryu. Kiryu has always been saved for the end of the game in these multiple character titles, but the writers wanted Yakuza 5 to feel more like Kiryu's story rather than a story that just happened to have Kiryu in it. So as part of how they went about achieving that, they decided to open the game with him this time so that they could frame the entire story from his perspective. In the 2 years since the events of Yakuza 4, Kiryu has moved down to Fukuoka and has been laying low as a taxi driver to try to make some money to send back to the Morning Glory orphanage. On one random night during his shift, Daigo Dojima of all people ends up getting into his taxi and speaking in code to Kiryu, telling him that the entire country might be on the brink of a massive war between the Tojo clan and the Omi alliance. Kiryu pretends to not know who he is or what he's talking about and ends up stopping on a random street corner and kicking Daigo out of the cab, only for him to then mysteriously disappear pretty much immediately after leaving Kiryu's taxi. This ends up getting Kiryu pulled into things, as the Tojo obviously have questions about Daigo disappearing after last being seen with him. He's also contacted relatively early on by some detectives who reveal that not only do they know who he is and have been keeping tabs on him all this time, but they also need him to help track down Daigo to ensure that a war doesn't break out in his absence. And soon enough, Kiryu is fully pulled back into the life that he keeps trying to run away from yet again. This is a really effective setup for the story, and luckily, Kiryu's portion of the game is also one of the best parts of the game. The Fukuoka map is set in the fictional district of Nagasugai, which in traditional fashion for the series is an incredibly accurate recreation of the real-life district of Nakasu in Fukuoka. A lot of the things that Fukuoka is known for in real life, like their famously good ramen, their food stalls, and the beautiful bodies of water, are all reflected here, which I of course love since one of my favorite parts of the series since the beginning is the lengths that the developers will go to reflect the unique culture of each region or city that they set the games in. And while we're on the topic of the new Fukuoka map, it's probably a good time to mention that for the first time since Kenzan, Yakuza 5 is running on a whole new engine. Okay, so maybe not a whole new engine, since it is just a heavily revised and updated version of the Kenzan engine, but there are a lot of foundational updates that you can really feel while playing the game, so the new engine is something that I'm going to bring up at least a couple times throughout the video. As far as the open world goes, the biggest thing that you'll likely notice right away is just how much they've improved the nighttime lighting in this engine. There's much more contrast in the lights and the shadows than there were in the Kenzan engine, and it really stands out when you're just out on the town at night and really taking it all in. On the flip side though, the daytime lighting in this game looks super blown out in a lot of places, so it's a bit of a weird trade-off. One of the best parts of the Fukuoka map though is the ability to actually go out and drive Kiryu's taxi around to earn some extra money. Every character in Yakuza 5 has been given their own unique side story, and driving the taxi around is Kiryu's side story. The driving itself had a ton of effort put into it by the developers, with the entire minigame feeling like it could have just been released on its own as an entire taxi driving sim. You have to follow the rules of the road constantly, including things like driving within the speed limit and using your turn signal before making a turn. You also have to do things like slowly and smoothly accelerate and hit the brakes while you have a passenger on board to make the ride smoother and more enjoyable for them. And on top of that, you're gonna have to keep conversation with them so that they don't get bored during the ride. So literally just anything that they could have done to make it feel like a more realistic taxi driving experience, they did. Each passenger that you pick up will also act as their own mini sub-story, with unique dialogue that adds a lot of extra entertainment value to every single ride. Like this one passenger that I picked up who really had to go to the bathroom, but was also running late for work and couldn't afford to take a pit stop before he got there. So for the entire drive, I had to constantly hype him up and encourage him to keep holding it in so that he didn't piss himself in the back of my cab. And in an unexpected twist, taking your typical taxi fares isn't all there is to do in Kiryu's side story, because he also ends up getting pulled into a street racing ring while on the job one day. This results in Kiryu repeatedly being challenged by street racers while driving his taxi, and needing to go up to the freeway to race with them. The street racing is a ton of fun, as I'm sure you can imagine racing a taxi around with electronic music blasting in the background would be, and it even has some mechanics added in like heat actions to make sure that it just retains a little bit of that unique Yakuza identity. So overall, Kiryu's side story was an absolute blast, and I ended up spending literal hours just driving the taxi around because I was having so much fun with it. It's a great piece of side content and a really strong introduction to Yakuza 5's new side story system. Back to some more traditional Yakuza content though, Kiryu's iconic combat style is pretty much untouched in Yakuza 5, but some great adjustments have been made here and there with it. Generally speaking, Yakuza 5's combat is exactly what you'd expect if you had played any earlier titles in the series. You've still got your mix of light attacks and heavy attacks, there are a bunch of different grab attacks you can do, and the way the heat gauge functions is basically the same. And wait a minute, are those new attack animations for Kiryu? If you've seen my Yakuza 3 or 4 videos, you'll know that new animations for Kiryu have been something that I've been dying for a while now, because for the most part, all of his animations were still the ones that they made while developing the original Yakuza back in 2005. They've taken a pretty interesting approach here in Yakuza 5 though, because they've made brand new, smoother looking animations for Kiryu, but they've left his core moveset basically untouched, and even things like the frame data have been kept the same, leading to his combat still feeling the same, but just looking nicer. The largest change to the combat sandbox here though is how they've repurposed Kiryu's red heat mechanics from Yakuza 3 and 4. In Yakuza 5, every character now gets a red heat action of their own, but it functions completely differently from what we saw in previous titles. Rather than needing to charge your heat gauge to the maximum to unlock a small handful of stronger heat actions, the red heat mechanics are now just simple attacks that can be activated anytime your character is in heat, with each character's red heat move being completely unique to them. Kiryu's is one of the coolest of the bunch too, with him gaining access to the new Dragon Spirit ability. This is essentially an enhanced heat state that you can enter that will drain your heat gauge rapidly, but give Kiryu complete immunity to all attacks, high damage combos that will break through the opponent's guard if they try to block them, the ability to basically teleport across the room to get right in the enemy's face, and even this huge throw that will knock down any enemy in your general vicinity. It's an insane buff that makes Kiryu feel even more like the unstoppable force that we all know he is by now, and one that's incredibly fun to whip out when you feel like you're on the back foot. So all up, Kiryu is incredibly fun to play as here, and he's only the first of 5 playable characters in this game. Moving into the second part of the game, we see the return of Taiga Saejima, the big, mean bulldozer of a man that we met back in Yakuza 4. After the events of that game, Saejima willingly went back to prison to serve out the rest of his sentence. While in prison though, we learn that Saejima's parole is being meddled with and blocked by some unknown party, and right around the time that all that is coming to a head, we also hear that Saejima's sworn brother Goro Majima has been shot and killed in the northern city of Sapporo. So naturally, Saejima stages yet another escape from prison in an attempt to reach the city of Sapporo and figure out what happened to Majima. And his portion of the story is a little odd in terms of structure, as the first 2 of his 4 story chapters take place entirely in the prison that he's being held in. These prison chapters have no side content whatsoever, and are purely made up of the main story content revolving around Saejima's parole and his eventual escape. After his prison break though, he nearly freezes to death in the woods, but he's rescued by a local hunter and brought back to a hunting village that's tucked away up in the mountains. Saejima's side story is probably the most unexpected of the bunch, and sees him venturing up into the wild on the mountain to hunt for the village in an attempt to pay them back for everything that they've done for him. Much like Kiryu's taxi side story, Saejima's hunting portions feel like they genuinely could have been an entire hunting game of their own. On top of just shooting animals like deer for things like meat and hides, you can also set up traps and come back to them later to passively catch things like rabbits and other small game. You can then sell everything that you hunt to a merchant back in the village in exchange for some upgraded equipment, and before you know it, you've completely forgotten that you were even playing a Yakuza game and have become entirely swept up in this hunting loop. It's got a lot of really cool features built into it that make it a genuinely fun side activity to keep coming back to, and while I personally didn't enjoy it as much as driving Kiryu's taxi, I still had a lot of fun with this one and probably spent more time hunting than I really needed to. In Saejima's 4th and final chapter though, he finally arrives in Sapporo, and this city finally ends up acting as his proper open world map. The Sapporo map is made up of the fictional district of Tsukimino, which is based on the real-life Sapporo district of Susukino. The map was once again built to strongly emphasize Sapporo's unique culture, with things like their famous beer, notably colder climate, and annual snow festival all being highlighted really well here. This is where Saejima finally gets to go out and engage with unique mini-games and sub-stories during his portion of the game, and it was easily one of my favorite cities in the game to explore, as having grown up in a more northern and cold city myself made the Sapporo map feel weirdly familiar and welcoming to me. As far as Saejima's combat goes though, it's a huge improvement over Yakuza 4. Everything that made Saejima fun to begin with is still here, with him still being incredibly hard to knock down and having those big charge attacks that let him hit like a damn freight train. But his overall kit has also been fleshed out a lot here, making him feel like a much more well-rounded character in Yakuza 5. The biggest of these new additions for him is easily his new counterattack option that's called the Tiger Dragon Drop, which is a headbutt variation of Kiryu's famous Tiger Drop. It's a bit silly to call it the Tiger Dragon Drop, but it really is a bit unfortunate that they came up with a move called the Tiger Drop years before adding in a character who was based around a tiger. This seriously enhances his defensive abilities, and allows him to slow down a bit in fights against stronger enemies or bosses, rather than just relying on his typical brute force approach. Another great addition that's been made is his new Red Heat ability, which allows him to grab enemies by the leg while in heat and just start whipping them around for some amazing crowd control that also deals massive damage to both the enemy you're throwing around and those that you hit with them. So overall, Yakuza 5's Saejima is a much more flexible character that allows for more varied approaches, especially when compared to his original appearance in Yakuza 4. It made him significantly more enjoyable to play as, though I definitely felt like his part of the game was a little bit stunted due to the fact that he didn't even gain access to an open world area until the very last chapter of it. So I would say that he's a really great character here, but the team probably should have given him a bit more time in the game and allowed him to breathe a bit more. Moving on to the third character though, this was an incredibly unexpected one, as for the third part of the game, we get to play as Kiryu's adoptive daughter, Haruka Sawamura. After being noticed by a talent scout while living in Okinawa, Haruka ended up moving to Osaka to pursue a career as a pop idol. When we get to her part of the story, she's still in the very early stages of her career and training, but is signed up to be part of the upcoming Princess League, a televised competition between up-and-coming idols to see who comes out on top, with the winner getting a major debut to kickstart their career. But while she's training for the Princess League, the president of Haruka's talent agency, who had slowly been becoming like a mother to her, suddenly commits suicide one night. And not only does everyone close to her, including Haruka, believe that this was incredibly out of character for her, but she had also just been telling Haruka about her plans to meet back up with her ex-husband the night before, and there are numerous signs of foul play in her death. So Haruka's portion of the story revolves around preparing for the Princess League so that she can get her big debut and make her recently deceased president's dreams come true, while also trying to investigate her death to find out if someone really killed her, and if they did, why they did it. Now, I mentioned that Haruka's part of the game takes place in Osaka, but what I haven't mentioned yet is that it also takes place in the very familiar fictional district of Sotenbori, which is returning from games like Yakuza 2 and Kurohyou 2. And as you might imagine, Haruka's gameplay is pretty different from the rest of the cast, as the developers didn't feel like Haruka was a character who would go around getting into street fights or solving problems with her fists. So instead, Haruka's core gameplay is made up of a series of smaller mini-games. Since her portion of the game revolves around training for the Princess League and building up her new career, you'll be doing things like taking dance lessons by playing a rhythm game in order to raise your performance stats. On top of that, you'll be doing things like meet and greet events where you need to manage how long you shake each fan's hand for, as well as the responses you give them in conversation to make sure they all leave satisfied, or performing on the streets and other smaller venues to try to get your name out there. These activities actually make up Haruka's side story, which has been directly tied into her main story, as doing things like meet and greets or public performances will not only grow her fan base, but also improve her stats a little bit as well, making these things absolutely critical to succeeding in the main story's Princess League. And as much as I might hate to admit it, I found myself genuinely having a lot of fun completing these smaller jobs and living out my idol dreams. They definitely got old after a bit, but they're a surprisingly welcome distraction and pleasant way to break up the game's overall pacing at about the halfway point. Probably the funniest part of Haruka's gameplay though is that since she doesn't get into fights in the streets, she doesn't have any proper combat. So in place of the traditional random encounters, the developers have added in dance battles for Haruka to get into while out and exploring Sotenbori. And yes, you heard me right, dance battles. These are also a rhythm game, much like the dance lessons and performances, but with the addition of needing to properly switch between these 4 different bars on the screen using the D-pad. Who wins and loses the dance battle is determined by this bomb timer that pops up in the center of the screen, with each successful input pushing the bomb a little bit towards your opponent's side of the screen. Whoever's side the bomb is on when the timer runs out and blows up will take a chunk of damage, so consistent performance is a must if you want to avoid taking damage. They've even added in heat dance moves that you can use that will do things like heal you, drain some of your opponent's health bar, drain some of your opponent's heat gauge, and so much more. I definitely don't enjoy the dance battles anywhere near as much as the traditional Yakuza combat, but I'd be lying if I said that they weren't wildly entertaining, and yet again, a nice change of pace for a bit near the halfway point of this ginormous game. So overall, Haruka is probably my least favorite character to play as out of the 5, but she's still decently fun, and I respect that they really went for something different with her. The 4th character in the game is another really interesting one, but for an entirely different reason from Haruka. See, halfway through Haruka's portion of the game, we're reintroduced to Shun Akiyama, another returning character from Yakuza 4, who's apparently been setting up a new branch of Sky Finance down in Sotenbori. It turns out that the president of Haruka's talent agency had actually been borrowing money from Akiyama in order to fund Haruka's career development. So after she dies, another company employee calls Akiyama over to talk about what they should do with her debt. Akiyama and Haruka then have an unexpected reunion after he arrives, and he ends up joining her and the other members of the company in investigating the president's death. But the interesting part isn't just that Akiyama and Haruka are the first characters in the game to overlap, or even that their portions of the game both take place in the same city. Rather, the interesting part is that these two share part 3 of the campaign. So rather than having 4 story chapters dedicated to each of them, Haruka gets a whole 2 story chapters to herself, and then for the 3rd and 4th chapters of part 3, Akiyama gets added in and you can swap between the two of them at any given time. And while he does have a set of sub-stories that are unique to him, Akiyama has the same open world map as Haruka. Additionally, Akiyama is the only member of the cast here to not have a side story available to him. So where Kiryu gets to drive his taxi, Saejima gets to hunt, and Haruka gets to build up her idol career, Akiyama just gets to do nothing. Him being the only character in the game to not get a wealth of unique side content led to me spending the least time with Akiyama out of any of the characters on the roster here, which was really disappointing for me, especially because Akiyama has easily become a top 3 character in the series for me since his debut in Yakuza 4. Thankfully though, what little time I did spend with him was still a lot of fun, as his combat style of constant offense through an onslaught of fast and powerful kick combos is still an absolute blast here. And much like Saejima, his combat has gotten some nice improvements from his Yakuza 4 appearance. These changes aren't as significant as the ones that Saejima got though, with most of them being small improvements to how already existing moves either function or feel. However, Akiyama's red heat mechanic is an amazing addition to his kit, as it allows him to launch enemies into the air and then jump up with them for some incredibly stylish air combos. And not only do these look really cool, but they're incredibly effective as well, as once you have an enemy off the ground, they're completely unable to defend themselves from your attacks. He's also gotten some new heat actions here, with that new one where he just takes an enemy to the wall and knees them like 6 times in the face being one of my favorites from the entire series so far. So overall, playing as Akiyama in Yakuza 5 is still a ton of fun, but it's a real shame that he was relegated to being a secondary character for Haruka's part of the game rather than getting his own time to shine and more exclusive side content. And last, but far from the least, we have the only true newcomer of Yakuza 5's cast, Tatsuo Shinata. Shinata is a former pro baseball player who, after hitting a game-winning home run in his first ever at-bat in the league, was accused of match fixing and sign stealing the very next day, leading to an investigation that would inevitably result in him being banned from professional baseball for life. We meet him a whole 15 years after said batting incident, where he now lives a very humble life in Nagoya, writing for a nightlife magazine to try to make ends meet. At the beginning of his story here, he's approached by a masked man who offers him a life-changing 20 million yen to look into what happened with the investigation 15 years ago, and figure out who framed him to get him out of professional baseball, and of course, why they would have done so. This leads Shinata down a very dangerous and unfamiliar path that, as you might imagine, eventually sees him discovering some connections to various Yakuza families and getting himself pulled into the larger conflict. This makes Shinata one of the most interesting characters we've seen in the series so far, as he's the first protagonist that we've ever gotten who has no connection to the criminal underworld of Japan whatsoever at the start of his story. His open world map is probably my favorite in the game, being set in the fictional district of Kinecho, which is based on the real-life Nagoya district of Nishiki. As always, Kinecho has been made to highlight the more unique qualities of Nagoya, such as their distinct love for spicy food and their amazing attractions. This is where all of Shinata's story and side content can be found, and I have to say, his part of the game was easily my favorite time that I spent with it. This was largely because of just how unique Shinata feels compared to any character that we've played as in the series so far, and to dig into that, I think it's best to start by covering his side story. See, even though Shinata has been banned from playing professional baseball ever again, he still has a strong passion for the sport, and spends just about all of his free time that he can over at the local batting cages. So his side story content largely revolves around taking challenges from local pitchers to further improve his batting abilities, while of course, spreading the love of baseball to whoever he can along the way. To make this more fun, the developers have completely overhauled the batting cage minigame that's been part of the series since the original entry. Instead of the batting cages just being a timing test like they were before, you now have a sort of crosshair that you have to line up with the ball's trajectory after it's thrown, and depending on which part of the cursor the ball is going to fall into, you'll have to press a different face button to actually get your bat to connect with it properly. This adds more of a skill requirement to the minigame, while also enhancing the RPG elements. See, I mentioned before that Shinata's batting abilities will actually improve the more that you practice it, with these skills doing things like increasing the size of the batting cursor, allowing Shinata to more accurately predict where the ball will end up, and even unlocking the Heat Eye ability, which allows players to see the ball move in slow motion for a short amount of time. On top of that, the local pawn shop carries a bunch of batting equipment, and buying better equipment will further enhance your abilities beyond the levels that you've already reached. And the best part of it all, everything that I just described is completely unique to Shinata. Other characters can still go to the batting cages and take a few swings whenever they want to, but when they do so, they end up essentially just playing the same batting minigame from Yakuza 4, as obviously, none of them are highly skilled former professionals like Shinata is. I mean, come on, giving him such a distinct and well-fleshed out advantage at one specific minigame just because it lines up with his backstory is some next level dedication from RGG. The sheer dedication from the developers, as well as just how fun it all is, ends up making Shinata's side story my favorite of the bunch, even beating out Kiryu's taxi driving from the earlier parts of the game. And keeping the ball rolling, Shinata also has probably the most unique combat style of any playable character in the series. His personality is even baked into his basic combos, with him having things like a heavy combo ender that mimics the motion of swinging a baseball bat at the enemies. His basic light and heavy attacks are actually the weakest of the entire cast though, encouraging players to use them sparingly and instead take advantage of his two greatest strengths. The first of these is his crowd control, which not only comes in the form of his grabs and various fancy moves that he can perform after grabbing the enemy, but also through his unique red heat mechanic, the tackle. This armor tackle can be activated after any heavy attack, and in exchange for some of your heat gauge, you can stun enemies against the wall and hit them afterwards for some extra damage, run them through a larger group of enemies to knock them all down along the way, or even just activate a heat move out of it that will almost always take out that tackled enemy. And his most unique strength is that he's also very good at using weapons. He gets way more damage out of them, more durability out of them, and even has a bunch of extra techniques and heat moves while using weapons that no other character has access to. But once again, the developers have taken this opportunity to inject his personality into his combat, as the one weapon type that he refuses to use is the baseball bat. This is due to his deep connection to the sport and the fact that he believes that the baseball bat should be respected and treated with care rather than swung around wildly. This made Shinata feel so meaningfully different from the other characters, as I've never really used the weapons in these games all that much, just because they never felt like they were all that valuable enough to even bother with, since they would just break so quickly and would also lock characters out of using the majority of their most powerful techniques. But with Shinata, not only do they last longer, but they're also much more effective while you're using them, making him into a character that genuinely feels like he's at his best when armed rather than unarmed. So all up, Shinata is a really cool character who feels like something legitimately different from everyone else, and it really made his portion of the game the most enjoyable for me. After his part of the game comes to a close though, all that's left is the finale. I say that like it's a small thing, but Yakuza 5's finale is actually a whole 5-chapter act that brings all of the main characters back together in Kamurocho and sees their stories all colliding in a big climactic ending. Once together in Kamurocho, each character can also travel to and from their respective cities by taxi just by paying the standard fare, so even once you're past each member's portion of the game, you'll still have plenty of time later to return and wrap up any side content that you might have otherwise missed. There's a ton more to talk about with that part of the game, especially story-wise, but first, I'd like to talk a little bit more about just a few general gameplay things that aren't specific to certain characters. First on my list is just how much smoother the combat feels in this new engine. One of the biggest improvements here is the lock-on, which has always been at least a little wonky throughout all of the games so far, but genuinely feels like it's been massively improved here in Yakuza 5. I found myself losing my tracking way less often, and if I locked on to one specific enemy, it would actually stay locked onto that enemy instead of just shifting focus to whoever happens to be closest to me. Another part of the combat that felt like a massive improvement here was the quality of the boss fights. These have also historically been a big rough spot for the series, with a lot of bosses that rely on just getting a ton of invincibility frames on their attacks and using them to shut down like 90% or more of your options. Here in Yakuza 5 though, the bosses felt significantly more balanced than they ever have before, with each of them still being challenging, but never really feeling like they were actively cheating just to win. This led to me easily having more fun fighting bosses here than I have in any of my time with the mainline games so far. Though Kurohyou 1 definitely still has it beat, but that's nothing against Yakuza 5. Kurohyou was literally built to play like a fighting game, so of course the bosses are well balanced and fantastic there. Point being, the bosses here are great, and definitely way more dynamic than previous games thanks to players actually having more viable options at their disposal. And speaking of being made more dynamic, the chase battles here have had some nice variety injected into them. All of the small improvements that Yakuza 4 made have been carried over here, and you can even now do full combos while running or use the glass bottles that you pick up along the way as melee weapons rather than just being able to throw them. They've also added more of those QTE sequences where the enemy you're chasing will randomly try to swing at you to get you off their tail, and you'll have to press the correct buttons quickly enough to counter their attack and keep chasing them. And on the topic of battles, I have to say that the random battles feel damn near perfect in this game. Random battles have always been one of the most hit or miss parts of the open world maps in these series for me, as too few of them make it hard to level up consistently, but too many of them can destroy the pacing of the game. There are still a ton of them scattered around in the cities here, and honestly, it might be the most of them scattered about that we've seen in the series, but they've been made so easy to opt out of if you'd rather just skip them. The enemies who initiate these battles have been slowed down considerably to make them much easier to run past, and they'll also yell loudly whenever you're near them and pop up with these very noticeable pink speech bubbles that make them easy to spot. This makes them almost entirely optional here in Yakuza 5, allowing you to still grind for XP or money when you feel like you need to, but also just run around them if you'd rather stick to what you were doing before. In my opinion, this is exactly the balance that these random battles should strive for, and I'd say that this is the closest to perfect that they've ever been in the series. Things like sub-stories and minigames are probably also at their best here, with the sub-stories all being full of personality and the minigames all being the most polished that they've ever been. And they've gone for both quality and quantity here, with a total of 78 sub-stories spread across the 5 characters and a whopping 31 unique minigames to go out and discover. All of the best new minigames here are found in the side stories, with things like the taxi driving or Shinata's batting, but if I had to pick a new favorite aside from those, I would have to go with the snowball fight minigame that you can find in Sapporo. Oh, and I can't believe that I forgot to write this down, but they also have a couple of classic Japanese arcade games available at the Club Segas now, like Virtua Fighter 2 and Taiko no Tatsujin. One of the coolest open world editions in Yakuza 5 though is easily that of the Victory Road tournament. This is a tournament that has organizers traveling all over Japan to try to find the strongest fighters in the country to bring them all together for one big fighting tournament. And as you might imagine, all 4 of our fighters end up catching the attention of these organizers. So during each character's portion of the story, if you participate in enough of the Victory Road qualifying matches around their respective cities, you'll get an official invite to the big event in Kamurocho. Meaning that if you get yourself an invite as each of the 4, they'll all be going up against each other in the finals. I unfortunately got all 4 of them entered into the finals, but then forgot to head over to the Coliseum when I reached Kamurocho for the finals, so I tragically missed it during my playthrough. But it's still a really cool way to broaden the scope of the underground fighting Coliseum that the series has always had, and make it feel more in line with the overall ambition of Yakuza 5. Another amazing addition here is that eating at restaurants can now give you certain buffs for a short amount of time, depending on what kind of food you eat. You won't know what buff a certain meal will give you until you've ordered it at least once though, which encourages players to go around to all the restaurants and try out each and every meal at least once to try to find the best place to get the strongest buffs for the cheapest prices. This is actually a shockingly clever addition, as the Yakuza games have always had these very thorough restaurant experiences that the developers use to try to showcase Japan's unique culinary cultures. So introducing a new system to them that gives you direct gameplay buffs encourages players to go around and really dig into these restaurants on a deeper level, rather than just treating them like an occasional healing stop when they're in a bad spot. It's honestly kind of crazy just how this one tiny tweak to an already existing feature made it so much more worthwhile to engage with, and I found myself shocked by just how much more frequently I was going out of my way to stop at restaurants, even when I wasn't low on health. And as one final note on the open world stuff before we get back to the finale, I thought it was really cool that RGG reached out to a bunch of Japanese magazines and asked if they would like to be in the game, and a lot of them took them up on the offer. So when you stop by a convenience store now, you can actually just go over to the magazine section and browse through a bunch of real magazines that have been scanned into the game, including some that I've talked about in earlier videos in this very series like Weekly Famitsu. There's no incentive to do this from a gameplay perspective, so it doesn't really factor into the overall design, but it's really cool that it's there, so I thought I would give it a quick mention. But with all that covered now, we can finally move on to the bit where we talk about the finale. I have quite a few thoughts on the last couple chapters of the game, but obviously, sharing those thoughts with you guys is going to mean spoiling the shit out of the ending. So if you're trying to avoid spoilers for Yakuza 5, just skip to the timestamp on screen and come back to us later. Okay, so as much as I enjoyed the majority of Yakuza 5's story, the ending was easily the messiest part of the entire thing. This ending bothered me on so many levels, so just bear with me because it might turn into a bit of a mini rant. The first thing that felt really weird to me is that half of the game's plot, if not more, revolves around Goro Majima and whether or not he's really dead. But when it's finally revealed that he is alive and he shows up during the final chapter, he barely even gets any spoken lines. You'd think that the character who's the driving force for more than half of the cast throughout the entire game would have something important to say during the big reveal, but he really doesn't, and he's kind of just there. And there's another issue with Majima's appearance here that's just a bit odd. During the finale, the four guys all split up to go and handle one of the converging threats, and you'd expect that each of the four of them would be going to handle the threat that's most directly tied to them, right? Well, Saejima ends up going to fight Majima because, you know, they're sworn brothers. This is fine on its own, but it's also just completely unnecessary, as Majima and Saejima already fought each other and reconciled their relationship back in Yakuza 4, so it's just a bit odd for them to repeat that here. It just makes the climax of Saejima's story feel a bit awkward for fans who have already played Yakuza 4, as we're effectively repeating the climax of his story in that game. That's not even the main issue though, as the real issue comes from where Shinata ends up during the finale. See, Shinata goes to prevent the assassination of Haruka at her big debut concert, and the assassin turns out to be Shigeki Baba, Saejima's former cellmate from prison. Yakuza 5 slowly builds the relationship between Saejima and Baba throughout their entire part of the game, showing us that Baba is an incredibly capable young man, but needs a good role model like Saejima in his life to set him on the right path. And for whatever reason, Shinata goes to be the one to fight him instead of Saejima, while Saejima gets to go and repeat a fight that we literally got in the last mainline game. Shinata's reason for fighting Baba is so dumb too, as by the time that he gets there, Baba has actually already made the decision on his own to not go through with assassinating Haruka, and was walking out when Shinata arrived. But the climax of the story obviously requires every character to have a big final boss fight, so Shinata gets pissed at him for leaving his camera behind and starts beating his ass. I get that they wanted to tie up Shinata's story with him sitting in the stands of what would normally be Tokyo's baseball field, but having Saejima fight Majima instead of Baba was a massive misplay in my opinion. Thankfully though, Shinata's story does get wrapped up really nicely after the fight with Baba, so much so that even though he's a new favorite character of mine, I don't feel like he needs to come back in later games really at all, because it was all just brought to a close in such a conclusive and satisfying manner here in Yakuza 5. Akiyama also gets a final battle that's just a bit weird. He ends up fighting the Yakuza that are flooding the streets in order to buy time for the other three to go and do their things, which is perfectly fine, but yet again, it just feels like Akiyama was a bit of an afterthought in this game. There's no major personal development or resolution for him here outside of the Yakuza all acknowledging his strength and promising not to mess with Sky Finance in the future. Which, don't get me wrong, it is a nice little moment, but it just feels like it falls a bit flat compared to everyone else's big climactic endings. Speaking of, now on to Kiryu's ending. Kiryu ends up fighting a man named Masato Aizawa as the final boss, a Tojo clan member who was formerly the personal bodyguard of Daigo Dojima. Near the end of the game, Aizawa ends up turning on the Tojo, and we find him at the Tojo clan headquarters after he slaughtered all of the Tojo patriarchs that were at the headquarters when he got there. He and Kiryu have a big final battle that's pretty awesome, but what happens after this fight is what struck me as a bit odd. See, after he's defeated, Kiryu ends up showing him mercy and telling him to spend time getting stronger so that the two of them can fight again someday. This would normally feel very in line with Kiryu's character, but are we just gonna forget that not 10 minutes ago we saw that he had slaughtered almost all of the Tojo patriarchs? I mean, Kiryu is definitely a more gentle and merciful character than most would expect, but the level of kindness that he shows Aizawa in the ending here feels kind of insane to me, purely because of just how awful the things Aizawa did just minutes beforehand actually were. And then, for the very end of the game, Haruka stops her big debut concert right in the middle of it, and picks up the microphone to come clean with her fans. She apologizes for hiding things from them, and reveals to the world that she's the daughter of the notorious Yakuza member Kazuma Kiryu. She goes on to explain that her time at the orphanage with Kiryu and the other kids meant more to her than this idle dream ever could, and that she feels horrible for having left them behind all to pursue this dream. So naturally, she proceeds to run off the stage and assumedly leave the idol industry behind entirely, and then the credits roll. This is a touching moment, and one that does make total sense given the overall themes of the game, but at the same time, I couldn't help but feel really frustrated by it. Haruka's dream is probably the single most important thing in the entirety of Yakuza 5's story, with Kiryu and Akiyama both pretty much dedicating themselves to helping her see it through, and Saejima and Shinata also helping to make the big debut go over smoothly in the end. I mean, hell, the entire reason that Kiryu was laying low and driving a taxi in Fukuoka instead of still being at Morning Glory was so that no one would find out that he was Haruka's father, and all of the money that he was making from driving was either being sent to Haruka herself or the kids back at the orphanage. So as much as I get what they're going for by having her leave it all behind in the end, it's still just really frustrating as a player to have that thing that you've been working towards over the course of this entire massive RPG just get thrown out in the final cutscene. I really do like Yakuza 5's story on the whole, but I think that the ending was a pretty big mess, mostly due to them trying to wrap up too many plot threads all at once, as well as a couple of really baffling decisions. It thankfully isn't so bad that it completely ruins everything that came before it in the story, but it definitely ends things on a bit of a sour note, which is just really unfortunate since everything that comes before it is, for the most part, really damn good. Overall though, I absolutely loved my time with Yakuza 5. It tells an epic story of following your dreams and finding your family over the course of nearly 40 hours of main story content, is filled to the brim with side content, and just generally feels like the culmination of everything the team at RGG had been building towards since the release of Yakuza 1. It's certainly not perfect, with some occasional pacing issues and bizarre writing decisions dragging things down a bit, but if you're a fan of the Yakuza titles that came before it, it's hard to imagine that you wouldn't be a fan of this one. It has the best visuals, combat, and side content offering to date, and regardless of how you personally feel about its main story, it's hard to deny that the team pulled off something truly incredible with this title. For the most ambitious and large-scale title in the series to be so consistently high quality is astounding, and I'm sure that for many members of the development team, this was the sort of game that they had always dreamed of making. I would even say that it's probably become my personal favorite game in the series so far, and while I think that Kadokia 1 is definitely still a more polished experience than this one, I was just constantly having fun during my 60-hour playthrough of Yakuza 5 in a way that's insanely impressive for a game of this length. So at the end of the day, I'm going to give Yakuza 5 an 8.6. Hey guys, thanks for making it to the end of this very long video. This one was a lot of time and effort between just playing through the game, writing the script, rewriting the script, and editing through the whole thing, so any sort of like, subscription, or share of the video would be greatly appreciated. If you really enjoyed the video and you want to help support more projects like this, and just the rest of my Yakuza series, feel free to check out things like my Patreon or my YouTube memberships in the description below. You can get things like behind the scenes updates on what I'm working on, early video access, and of course, just join the amazing group of people who make these series possible. With all that being said though, I'm gonna let you guys go. So thank you once again for watching the video, and I hope to see all of you right back here next time for the next Yakuza review.